We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes masks.
We need to think outside the box as much as possible as to how to approach immigration in the second Trump administration. And when I was thinking through that, who are like among the most outside the box thinkers I could think of? Andrew Yang. And Andrew is an author, an investor, an entrepreneur, really became a household name during the 2020 presidential campaign. I know that I had at least 2 cousins and 1 nephew and 1 niece who were part of the Yang gang. And so I knew that, I was like, wait, what? In 2021, he actually ran for mayor of New York City in the Democratic primary. And since then, he left the Democrats to start his own political party called the Forward Party. Andrew, thank you so much, or maraming salamat, as we say in Tagalog, for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I appreciate the invite a great deal. I like the intro too. Thank you to your family members and friends who
texted me.
Yeah, we're part of the Yang Gang. Thank you.
And I have to say, I was probably, I'm trying to remember, I covered the 2008 presidential campaign for the Washington Post.
So were you in Iowa, New Hampshire?
Iowa has 99 counties. I went to every single one of them.
Yeah,
Back
me
then,
too.
there were only 4 Starbucks in all of Iowa, and I knew where they were because that's where I had to file my story. And I'm saying this because back then, everybody was looking at me because I think I must have been one of the only Asian American, certainly one of the few Asian American male reporters. So to have to me, your running for president in 2020 was like the Jeremy Lin moment in politics.
Oh,
right?
That's high praise because I was part of the Linsanity crew, cheering him on at every step.
Wow! Jeremy Lin does it again!
But I think, again, as an Asian American man, I think it's one of those moments where you knew where you were when Jeremy Lin hit. You knew where you were when Andrew Yang was running for president. You knew where you were when Daniel Day Kim was premiering a Broadway show on 42nd Street. So these are moments. And so for that, thank you. Now, I'm just going to dive right in because as someone who's never voted, right, because as an undocumented person, that was something I could not do, I can't do. I've always had to say that I'm an independent. Right? I've never voted. I'm not a registered anything. Technically true.
Yeah.
So this idea of breaking up with the Democratic Party, and you did this in October 2021.
Yeah, that's right.
How has that been going?
It's been a fascinating journey. I did write a book about how I arrived at this point. And what happened, Jose, just in practical terms, okay, I run for president.
From New York, businessman Andrew Yang.
Mr. Yang, your main solution to job loss from automation is a universal basic income.
A universal basic income is a policy where every citizen in a country gets a certain amount of money free and clear to do whatever they want. So my plan, the Freedom Dividend, would give every American adult $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year starting at age 18. I come off the trail and I feel despondent about the direction of American politics, even though my campaign probably overachieved expectations. But yes. I didn't come off thinking we're going to be fine. I came off thinking it's worse than I thought. And so I tried to dig into why I felt like things were just going to continue to descend. And I concluded that because of the way our 2-party system is designed, it's designed very, very poorly. And I'm just going to go back in time for a little bit. If you look at the Constitution of the United States, there's not a word about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. The Founding Fathers actually hated parties. George Washington warned against them on the way out. John Adams called 2 parties an evil across the land. Mm-hmm. James Madison talked about factions that don't shift and that's what you have to avoid. So the Founding Fathers never would have imagined we're in this current 2-party system that is enforced completely artificially at the state level. And what's happened is the country has been divvied up into blue zones and red zones. Mm-hmm. You live in California, which is a blue zone. We're in a blue zone right now in New York. You go to Montana or Missouri and it's a red zone. And this is not going to lead to intelligent policy decisions or solutions for the biggest issues of our time. And you could certainly put immigration and treatment of undocumented immigrants as a crucial issue. You could put climate change, you could put education, you could put poverty, which is my driving force.
A signature issue.
Yeah. And you could ask, like, why have we never really made progress on poverty? By the way, the biggest progress we made was in 2021 when we enhanced the child tax credit.
The new child tax credit in the latest coronavirus economic relief plan just passed by Congress will provide extra money to most American families. But experts believe it could potentially have a profound effect on poverty in the country.
And then we undid it 15 months later. And that infuriated me because 130 economists said, hey, we should keep doing this. Poor kids are actually climbing out of poverty because we're, sending money to their families.
This is the worst time. This is the worst time for the immigrant rights movement.
Yeah.
You're looking at Democrats who are sounding like Republicans, right? So how do we build? How do we then, this is why I'm interested in the Forward Party. How do we then, for example, take border security, right? Border security, Trump, the moment he got down that escalator and said what he said about Mexicans.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Border security became this mainstream conversation. And yet, my experience, when you talk to people of various different backgrounds, people don't actually understand how much money we already spend on the border. How many more billions of dollars do we want to spend?
Well, part of this too, Jose, and this is another frustration I think we should have in American life, and it's partially because of the erosion of local journalism and a lot of other things. But so, what we argue in all the time now? Just freaking dollar signs. It's like, hey, we spent $4 billion on the border. Like, is that enough? Is that too much? Like, I don't know. And then someone would be like, hey, let's send some more money. 9 times out of 10, the money does not actually tell you what's happening. And I'm going to use an example. Classrooms. Like there are times when, in New York City, we might be spending like $35,000 per student per year. So if you do the math, if you had a room of 30 kids, it might be $1 million. And then you'd be like, oh, these kids must be getting the best education in the world.
Yeah.
And then they may or may not. They're not in this case. And so there are two measurements. One is the budget, which is all we can see because we actually are now trained to be arguing over these evident metrics. But then the reality on the ground is like, okay, like what does another billion get you? And so the border being an example where, I talk to folks who are at the border, and like, even if you had the money, it turns out you can't do certain things because, you're having massive turnover problems or like the personnel or like you have to station someplace, like kind of remote in the middle of nowhere, and like people don't want to. So, it's really unfortunate what's happening, and the argument we're making at Forward is that the binary will not lead us out of this. And when you talk about how this is a terrible time for
immigrant rights in general.
Yeah. So I'm going to give my perspective. I got into public life in part to keep Trump from returning to office, and so I've been incredibly sad by his return to office. I think it's going to be a very, very dark time. And one of the things that I do, not to be, it's because like I'm an optimistic, pragmatic person. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build the alternative political movement, which is not easy and it's not fast. I actually would compare it to local journalism where like, it's the right thing, but it's very, very nitty gritty, blocking and tackling. The economics are not great. So Forward now has, let's call it 46 aligned elected officials, after operating since, essentially 21, making progress, but it's going to take a little bit.
And when I think of you and I think about, the Forward Party, when I think of what you've done with universal basic income and Humanity Forward, this question of privilege, right? People who have privilege, the question for me is, what are you going to do? What are you doing to risk that privilege? And in many ways, that's what you've been doing.
Thank you for seeing it in that way. I mean, in my case, I started a nonprofit back in 2011 that actually ended up leading me down this entire road, where my presidential run was what to me it felt like a natural extension of my work at Venture for America, because we were trying to create a more dynamic, welcoming human economy that like people could thrive in. And then I became convinced that you were going to need something much more dramatic in the form of universal basic income to create conditions for us to thrive in. And then that has led me to the fact that our political system, and so when you talk about, my campaign, I at the time thought if you got enough Americans behind universal basic income, you would get a universal basic income. And then I grew to conclude that no, like that's not how it works. You can get 70, 80% of us on board with something like campaign finance reform or immigration reform.
Dream Act, for example.
Right. Or anti-poverty, and we still don't get it. And so then I went to the next thing, which is like, we actually have to fix the political system, which, which is a very, very heavy lift. But a lot of people believed in me. And I'm still working on it. You know what I mean? Like when someone comes up to me on the street and it's like, "Hey Yang, where's my $1,000?"
What do you say?
I say, I am working on it.
You are working on it.
I am working on it. And it's something that, I wish I could deliver faster. And so in 2020, I come off the trail. You'll appreciate this because how many books have you written, Jose?
Oh, only one. I'm finishing a second one.
All right. So, but you can relate to this. So check it out. I come off the trail. I'm super sad about the general direction, but my thoughts are still, somewhat unformed. And then, my agent comes to me and says, "Hey, people really want you to write a book." And then I thought, okay, I'll write a book about what the heck is going on with American democracy, and that way I can get, frankly, paid to do research. Yeah. So I then spent the next year or so figuring out some of these design problems and concluding that. And so this is one of the things I try and break down for people. And folks who are listening to this podcast, I'm sure, are in despair about the direction of American politics and why it seems so irrational and dysfunctional and the rest of it. It's predictable in a certain way. And so hear me out for a second. So the myth, and what's funny is I'm talking now to people who probably don't vote. So you might think it's like, hey, the myth in American life is everyone votes, whoever gets 51% becomes your leader, and then that's the way it works. Not true at all. The way it actually works is that and so one of the things I throw out to people, what is the approval rating for U.S. Congress right now?
What is it, 23%, 24?
It's a bit lower now. It's around 16, 17%. What is the re-election rate for incumbent members?
Oh, 25%?
94%. If you are an incumbent
Wait a second.
member...
Say that again? 94%.
94% of incumbent members of the House will win re-election.
Because people are not paying attention.
No. It's because of the design. And this is what you have to understand, Jose. Check it out. It turns out 90% of the districts in the United States are drawn to be either quite blue or quite red and are uncompetitive in the general election.
Yep.
And so if you live in the Bay Area, there's a zero chance that a Republican is going to end up representing that district. Do you know who your member of Congress is?
Latifah Simon.
All right.
A dear friend, actually.
So Latifah has absolutely no concern about losing her race to a Republican challenger. There might be some, like sacrificial lamb that runs against her, but it's like a non-factor. To the extent that Latifah ever has any concerns, it's that she gets primaried from within the Democratic Party. And even then, she'd probably be fine. But that is actually the cudgel like it's used against any member. So let's take a Republican in Missouri. zero chance they're going to lose to a Democrat. But the only concern they'd have is that the party bosses in D.C. say to them, we're going to primary you. And then they say, oh, no, please, I'll take back whatever I did to piss you off if you're going to primary me. So you have a 94% incumbent reelection rate because 90% of the congressional seats are drawn to be either blue or red. You have, let's say 10% in any given cycle that are genuinely competitive. So both parties say, look, over there, that's where the fight is, when in reality, 9 out of 10 of them are foreordained. And then the incentive structure then is not to make 51% of the people in your community happy. It's to stay on the good side of whoever is going to vote in your party's primary, which is about 10% of the electorate. So what happens is that that Republican representing Missouri has to keep 10% of the voters who vote in the Republican primary placated and pleased. And if they do that, then they have absolute job security. If they go against that 10%, and by the way, that 10% doesn't line up with, frankly, like mainstream points of view a lot of the time.
Yes.
And so what happens is you have the parties that are then beholden to ideologically extreme voters oftentimes. And then you have media organizations that are trying to separate us into Team Blue and Team Red. And then you have social media pouring gasoline on the whole thing. And so your policies get more and more distorted and distended and unrelated to what 51% of the population wants.
And I think, looking again, if you have not read the breakup letter, it's on your website, andrewyang.com. You should check it out. Because my favorite part of it was when you actually wrote, I'm not very ideological, I'm practical. Making partisan arguments, particularly expressing what I often see as performative sentiment, is sometimes uncomfortable for me. I often think, okay, what can we actually do to solve the problem? Like that answering that question of what can we do to solve the problem, that's not what animates our politics.
No, because at this point you have this tribalized symbolic warfare where I'm not actually even trying to solve the problem. I'm just trying to animate energy and money in a particular direction. And the policy is now irrelevant in terms of my political prospects.
Well, I think in many ways, and you talk quite a bit about this, which I really appreciate as somebody who covered this, right? Like when you're covering a campaign, which I did for 2 years, you really see how theater, it's so much of it is theater, bad theater for the most part. And so much of it is about not only keeping up appearances, but instead of actually trying to figure out, wait a second, what's the problem? What are the options for the solutions? And how do we get there? And now I want to deep dive a little bit on this because as somebody, again, who's grown up in this era, I don't know what centrist or moderate is. Like in the Trump era, I don't know what those mean. And when it comes to immigration with the Forward Party, how would you characterize the Forward Party's approach on to actually coming with solutions to our immigration problems?
So the Forward Party's goal is to make it so that our political system actually functions. And if we had a functioning political system, I think most of us know where we would land on immigration, genuinely. I mean, you can look at the numbers where the vast majority of Americans agree on some combination of path to citizenship for undocumented and enforcement of the border and trying to identify high-skilled workers or folks who are pursuing
H-1B visas, all of that.
That sort of thing. And the reason why we don't get any of those things is because at this point you have a political system that would actually punish you if you tried to implement what most Americans want. And I have some proof of this, that you remember at this point, it might have been 10 years ago, where Marco Rubio proposed, immigration reform from the Republican Party.
We are dealing with 11 million human beings who are here undocumented, the vast and enormous majority of whom have come here in pursuit of what all of us would recognize as the American dream. I think we need to be honest with ourselves about how important immigration is for our economy, for agriculture, for guest workers and other laborers.
I have a basic question for you, Senator. Do you support your own bill?
There are elements that need to be improved.
He came back and was like, I'm just kidding. And what happened to him is that everyone in his party went to him and said, Marco, you do this, we're going to take a beating. You don't do it, we can just keep inflaming folks and blaming the Dems and raise money. And so it was a U.S. senator who said to me that we're at a point in American life where keeping a problem around is better for us politically than trying to solve it.
I'm sorry, I have to ask. Can you name the senator?
Shoot, I mean, I like to not out people, but in this case, I'm let's just say it was a moderate Republican who was very, very frustrated with the system.
Got it. Well, now following up on that, so here we are. I never thought, having grown up in Silicon Valley, right? I grew up literally in Mountain View before Google got there. I never thought H-1B conversation would be a mainstream conversation. And following what that conversation is like, we have Steve Bannon, right, saying, oh, no, it's stealing away jobs from American workers. And then you see Elon Musk. Like, what would be like the forward party's approach on H-1B visas?
So again, we want a functioning political system, and so the approach on H-1B visas would be probably what like most Americans would prefer. And I actually have not seen the numbers on where Americans are.
I don't know how much polling has been there.
I don't know either. I will say I personally am very much for trying to retain America's status as a magnet for human capital and folks that want to do well. And I want to go back into my own family for a little bit. So my
I was going to ask you that, but please, your dad had like 50 patents.
So my dad immigrated to the U.S. as a graduate student. He got his PhD in physics at UC Berkeley, right
where he met
where you are.
Where he met your mom?
Where he met my mom, who was getting a math degree. And had also immigrated from Taiwan. So it was just two nerdy Taiwanese grad students, walking around Berkeley. And they got married. My dad worked for GE and IBM and generated 69 U.S. patents for...
Oh, 69.
And those patents, I remember as a teenager, I asked my dad, it's like, hey, how much money do you get when you create a patent? And he said, about $300. And then I said, well, it doesn't seem like an awful lot. And he said, well, I also get paid a salary, so I can feed, house, and clothe you and your brother. And it's like, it was pretty much like a shut up type thing. But I raise this to say, most Americans would see what happened with my parents and think that's like a pretty great deal all the way around. Like immigrated here, helped American companies become more innovative, and then got to raise a family. My brother and myself here, and then we just tried to do well in school and get good jobs and add value. In our case, I say all the time where the American dream has worked out great for my family, and I want to give back. Very, very conscious of the fact that the American dream is not functioning very well for a whole lot of people right now, but certainly I owe this country a lot. My family owes this country a lot.
Actually, just making sure that this is something that in this podcast we try to do a lot of, which is really understand people's immigration backgrounds, right? So I'm glad that you brought this up. So your parents were able to come here. Did they come on a student visa, or were they able to come post 1965, the Immigration Act?
They came right after 1965, but they were students. It's funny. I'm not even sure how this went down, but they were employable, and thus I think that they came over post 1965.
I asked this question because we just did this podcast with Gene Wu. We were talking about how a lot of Asian Americans, there's 22 million of us now, 22 million. Most of us don't know that the 1965 Immigration Act, which is how most of us are here, happened because of the 64 Civil Rights Act, right? Like that a lot of what black people fought for to kind of open up the way the way this country is welcoming of people is because of that. And I think that's the kind of connection. And it's fascinating watching you these past few years with universal basic income, right? And the South, and how this, when you said the gratitude, I think connecting those dots between immigrants, Asian American immigrant families can come here post 65 within 2 generations, build wealth, right? And you have black people who built this country, who've been here for, since its founding, since 1619, right? Who have not been able to build wealth for various systematic reasons. And I think that conversation to me is really fertile ground. And I feel like you have been a part of that conversation because of UBI. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And then I'm going to go back to immigration because I think that's connected too.
No, sure thing. So I'm a numbers person, and the American economy has stopped functioning for a lot of people for a while. Certainly, it is divergent based upon race and a lot of other factors. But one of the things that I was excited about universal basic income was that this was a message that was championed by Martin Luther King in the days before he was killed, and the days before he was assassinated. He had actually gone full bore on economic justice, economic security.
But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness.
Which was always a part of his message from the very beginning.
Yeah. I mean, what did he say the three evils were? It was racism, war, and poverty. And then people don't think about the poverty element as much. I wish that people focused on that aspect of his message. And he said, look, poor blacks and poor whites should team up on this because this is, and they were even arguing back then that technology was going to automate away a lot of the jobs. And so I was on a panel with Michael Tubbs, who was mayor of Stockton at the time. You probably know.
I know Michael, yes.
Yeah, and so I was making the case for a universal basic income, and then afterwards he pulled me aside and said, Andrew, you can get away with saying shit I could never get away with, because if a young black mayor says, hey, we should start giving everyone money, then people will be like, oh, you know, you're a socialist, you're nuts. But then if the magical Asian man from the future says we should start giving everyone money, people are like, huh, interesting.
If the magical Asian man, how do we connect the dots between, okay, UBI, poverty is a solvable issue.
Yeah, poverty is, I think, our most solvable major problem.
Can you unpack that for me? What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So check it out. Our GDP now is up to approximately $78,000 per human. And it's going up pretty quick. AI, which is going to have some very negative effects, but AI will probably juice that number past 80,000 pretty shortly. And so check it out. We come, it's funny because, it's like my family immigrated here. But there's like an American ethos where you come here, wilderness, got to work. You don't work, you die, like that kind of thing. Manifest destiny, got to settle the West. You don't settle it, you die. Like that. There's a scarcity element that's baked into our economic thinking. But the numbers are that we actually are going to be at a point where we could resolve poverty for the American people quite straightforwardly and affordably. And even if I were to say to you, hey, 80,000 a head, you'd look at that and be like, wow, 80,000 a head, you could probably give people a certain amount. And I was arguing for $1,000 a month, which would put you still a bit below the poverty line. But it would be a really nice running start. And when I spoke to black groups, I would say to them, look, I've seen the numbers. Black net worth in America, and famously right now people know it's maybe 10 or 12% of average white net worth. But here's what a lot of people don't know, Jose. Projections are it's going to trend to zero over the coming years. Average black net worth is trending to zero. And then I asked them, like, why do you think that is? And what I said is that you're going to have the equivalent of an economic natural disaster unfolding. And who suffers in a natural disaster? And then black people like us. It's like, yeah, you. So if it's a hurricane or a flood or fires,
or a fire, as we're seeing in Altadena.
Yes,
right?
Then poor suffer disproportionately because you don't have any place to go to. You don't have the resources. You don't even have like higher ground, places to stay, vehicles, whatever. The same thing is happening economically, where AI is coming. It's going to decimate call center jobs and retail jobs and on and on. Driving jobs, which, by the way, driving is truck driving is the most common job in 29 states. So, when AI gets to that, it's going to be a huge problem. For a lot of folks. And so I would say to Black communities, like, look, like we're going to try and provide everyone a foundation, and $1,000 a month is going to be more meaningful to people who are coming off a lower base. But you can make an argument for the entire population, and I would make the argument in Iowa, which, as you know, is 94% white, and I wouldn't make it on a racial basis. I wouldn't say to the folks in Iowa, it's like, hey, but if you just had like a what seemed like a fair amount, then people would look at it and say, okay, like that seems fair. But it would help the poor a lot more. I mean, like some of my wealthier friends, you give them $1,000 a month, they might not even notice. But
clearly,
yes.
some of the data has shown that $1,000 from people who need it
is a game changer.
Life-changing.
Yeah. I mean, that is a complete...
You see this in Stockton.
Stockton, California made headlines for becoming the first city in the U.S. to test out the idea. Since 2019, Stockton has given 125 randomly selected individuals a special debit card loaded with free money each month.
And I remember when UBI was happening, and the fact that became like in many ways, the experiment, right? And the results, and also the consequences.
People who received the money were twice as likely to find full employment than those who did not.
So talk to me a little bit about the racial part of this. Because when people talk about this, they don't want to talk about the racial part of it, right?
Well, so I hearken back to Dr. King's message on this, which was, look, let's band together, regardless of race. If you're economically, on the outside looking in, like, we can do better. And I know, again, if I look at the major problems, this one is so solvable. By the way, when I was running in 2020, people would look at me and say, like, it is not possible for the government just to turn around and send everyone money. And then what happened like X months later? It's like, it's turn around, so, and then they would look at the affordability too. And I'd say, look, we bailed out Wall Street for $4 trillion. Like, does anyone remember being consulted or any hand wringing about not having enough money? If you can universalize it, and then it has disproportionate impact on folks who need it more, which again does overlap very heavily with communities of color. But one of the things that I want to put out there is that there's this false dichotomy in American life, in my opinion, where it's like, hey, you've got white, black, top, bottom, Democrat, Republican. Yeah. You have to pick one, and there's like this like
the binaries of American life.
The binaries of American life, and one of the major things I concluded, and I'm very confident in this, is that we will not get where we want to go if you succumb to the temptation to see it in the binary.
Absolutely agree.
And I'm going to suggest something too for the folks. This is and it's funny as I get technical, but so there are some folks who see democratic politics as the path towards solving all these problems, and I'm going to say that it's not happening, and I'm going to give you the math on it. So right now, the Republicans hold the U.S. Senate 53-47, but the way the map plays out is that the Senate is going to keep trending more and more Republican based upon the number of states that are red. And I'm just going to use a couple of examples that some people will be able to understand quickly. The Democrats just lost a Senate seat in West Virginia and Ohio. They're never going to get a Senate seat back in those two states. It's not like a Democrat's going to win in West Virginia anytime. Like, Joe Manchin was kind of a relic. Same thing with Sherrod Brown in Ohio. So now that those guys are out, like, those seats are essentially gone for the foreseeable. And so the only way that Democrats could conceivably win the U.S. Senate would be if a bunch of red states started going blue. And that's, you can just think about that and be like, do you actually see that happening? Like the mathematical cap for Republican senators now in the U.S. Senate is closer to 60 than 50. And the mathematical cap for Democrats is closer to 50 than anything else. Like, like they can't get a majority in the Senate anymore the way things are currently set up. And because of that, they will never be able to pass any meaningful legislation. Like the Democratic politics, it's all a waste of time at this point. And I'm not even talking about the November results, Trump's return, like the, crumbling faith in institutions. I'm saying by the math, the Democrats are like, it's a near impossibility for them to control the U.S. Senate at any point in the next, 12 years.
Well, okay, so
15 years.
So now let's
you
hone
put
in.
any number on it. It's but they'll never tell you that. What they'll tell you is send us money.
Yep. I get the fundraising emails from the Republicans and the Democrats. This is how independent I am. I actually signed up for both.
I wound up on both on the I get the Republican stuff too. It's funny. But yeah, and I donate money to various political figures, the vast majority of whom are Democrats. So I get a lot of emails too.
Now, okay, wait. So now let's hone in on this again as a first generation American, Taiwanese American. So now let's hone in on this. What you just described, the math that you just laid out.
Yeah.
Okay. Right now, as we're talking, and again, we're talking a week before the inauguration, right? Right now, many Democrats in Congress are working with Republicans to pass the Laken-Riley Act, which I'm sure you've heard about, which would require immigration officials to detain immigrants who have been accused, not convicted, just accused, right, of stealing more than $100 worth of property, including immigrants who have been explicitly granted permission, like TPS holders, DACA holders. Ruben Gallego, which I can't wait to talk to Senator Gallego about this, has come out for this, has come out supporting this. And I think said something along the lines of, I think that was John Fetterman, who said that if you don't support this act, then you're not grappling with why we just lost the election.
Well, I think if we can't, there's 47 of us in the Senate, and if we can't pull up with 7 votes, if we can't get at least 7 out of 47, and if we can't, then that's the reason why we lost.
And then as I'm thinking to myself, wait, is this part of the theater of this is for Democrats to make sense on immigration, they have to sound like Republicans. Is that what this is about?
I think that is what this is about. Yeah, like I think folks like John Fetterman. I actually didn't know about Ruben
Gallego.
But it's a border state, Arizona. So what they're doing is they're seeing the politics of this issue and saying, and this is again the unfortunate reality of like this binary construction that we're in, where it's like, are you for or against this act? And then people who want to demonstrate a measure of independence from party orthodoxy or line up with what they think their constituents want to see or hear will say, well, shoot, I don't want to be against this act, so I'll raise my hand and be for it.
For me, I want to use this act, this Laken-Riley Act, as a metaphor not only for the moment that we're in, but for what it says about the fact that we don't think of immigrants. This is a country founded in the due process of law, right? But clearly, in this context, immigrants don't deserve due process. Undocumented immigrants, the illegal aliens, don't deserve it. Is that the message, basically?
No, and this is one reason why it's so painful, Jose, is that you have like a very significant undocumented population. And in my opinion, they're like vastly different situations.
Vastly different situations.
Like vastly different situations. But because of the dysfunction of our politics, we're going to treat categories of millions of people like in this
one size fits all.
Yes.
So we are stuck in the binary,
and
then we have a one-size-fits-all approach from just yesterday. I'm here in New York. This is where we're filming this. I'm in New York, and I went to the dry cleaning person, and this man approached me, undocumented, Korean guy. And you know what he said to me? He goes, I know who you are.
Oh, good.
And he goes, I don't know why you keep talking about it, because people think this is a Latino thing and you keep wanting to make it an Asian thing. Can you stop?
Wow, Jose.
What do I say to him? I'm sure my eyebrows responded.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Other than that, like, what do you, if you were, I was actually rendered speechless. And And also that, of course, my journalistic instincts kicked in. I was like, oh, so are you undocumented? Like, how's it going?
Then he's like, oh,
yep.
let's stop this
He's
combo.
undocumented. 1 out of 7 Koreans in this country is here illegally. 1 out of 7, right? And yet, is that part of the narrative at all?
No, it's really not.
Why? And again, why do you think that is?
Well, it's because we live in a very, very simplistic time.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, we're operating in caricatures. It's one reason why I think the work you do is so important is that you humanize. Like in broad strokes, the enemy now is dehumanization, and the antidote is trying to regard each other as 3-dimensional flesh and blood humans with, like disparate views and like all sorts of different experiences instead of getting treated.
Listening to you here, I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a second. If that's the math, that's the logic, this is the theater part of it. So
yeah, so the problems are interconnected.
They're totally interconnected.
Yes.
And so then this gets us to, maybe this is something that we can, this is our first conversation. And what I would really like to do though is this question of how do you solve immigration? Like, how can that be like a recurring conversation? Who are the people who are actually interested in solving what people think this problem is? Because I got to tell you, the fact that here we are now, 3 decades. I moved here in 1993. Where we were in the 1990s on this issue is basically we haven't really moved.
Well, so this issue, but you could throw again poverty in there. You could throw climate
gun
change
control,
in there.
You can throw a lot of other issues in there.
You could throw a lot of issues in there, and this is, to me, a path to disaster, and it's going to tear us apart. I mean, I think the community you're describing is now bearing the brunt of the corrosiveness and the dysfunction.
Now, let me ask you this. Again, I like numbers too. So the 22 million Asian Americans in this country, 70% of Asian American adults are immigrants. Asian Americans are more immigrant. Asian Americans are more immigrant than the Latino community is immigrant, right? And yet on this issue, on undocumented immigrants, on H-1B visas, I'm really curious, where do Asian Americans fall, right? I actually don't know. I mean, there's some, AAPI data, the American Asian, TAF, the Asian American Foundation is doing some research and reports, but I feel like in many ways, Asian American voters could be like a real bridge.
So Asian Americans, somewhat diverse in terms of like party and politics. A bunch have gone to the right recently, based upon public safety / crime,
Stop Asian hate, of course,
and education. They look at this and be like, WTF? We're getting beaten up in the street, and no one's talking about it. And like I like whoever. Right now they're also so they swung to the right, which something that what I'm saying is, look, Asian Americans, what we are is pragmatic. We're not ideological. We just want stuff to work better, and this binary is going to be a loser for us. It's a loser for us. My perspective, the Republicans are not going to take Asian American concerns, like super seriously, and there is a real strain of xenophobia in that crew. And then the Democrats also don't really take us that seriously because we're kind of low on the totem pole, and they have like a bit of a hierarchy going. And so my argument to Asian Americans was like, look, this system poorly set up. We're here. We benefited from this country working well. This country is going to work less and less well. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do is trying to help it work better again. And the way to do that is, again, not from within this two-party system. It's to create our own thing. And the downside of if you create your own thing, let's call it the forward party, your downside is that one of the two parties has to actually compete for you and be responsive. Because right now, they do not feel that pressure at all.
No, they do not.
They do not. So your upside is that maybe we actually get a seat at the table. And this current political system is going to it's never going to put us where we want to be. We have to create our own thing, and that Asian Americans can be the bridge builders, this third way. And then when you talk about even immigration legislation, the vision is that imagine if you had not 2 but 3 parties in the Senate or in Congress, which, by the way, is much more feasible than people imagine. You would probably need 3 U.S. senators to declare independence in the parties, which is something that has been kind of happening if you look up and notice. I mean, and so if you can imagine that there were 3 parties in both houses of Congress and not 2, which you could get to with 5 to 10% of the vote, and then that third party in the middle would look and be like, okay, guys, let's actually solve the problem. Let's not just use it to beat up the other side. Let's not just use it as like our like galvanize the, ideologically oriented. Let's in real life solve the problem, make people's lives better, sort it out. That to me is the only way you actually can get real progress made on my issue, which is poverty. But
which is related to immigration.
Which is related to immigration. I mean, everybody's connected.
That's the other thing too. It's, like people forget that within the Asian American community, we actually have the largest gap when it comes to income. Like the gap between the richest Asian Americans and the poorest Asian Americans.
We're the most economically diverse.
We're the most economic. Yeah. And all you got to do is go to Chinatown here in New York City to know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Right? And so people don't know that. People just assume that Asian people are all wealthy people, and that's not the case.
By the way, in my opinion, you solve for poverty, and all of a sudden our treatment of immigrants gets much, much better. Because what is the emotional chord that's being struck right now? Why are these people making out when I'm not making out?
But that has been an eternal question of American life.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Right?
But so if you actually felt secure and that you thought, hey, I'm going to be fine, my kids are going to be fine. It's like, oh, there's an issue. It's like, okay, let's figure out what to do about it instead of this emotional us versus them, invasion narrative, like any of that stuff.
Let me just kind of synthesize this. So in this conversation, we have connected the dots between universal basic income, Martin Luther King's, from the very beginning pledge on we have to eradicate poverty, race and immigration. We have done all of that while in this container of politics as theater. Look at the math in the Senate, right? I have one request. One request is that as this podcast keeps going, I actually want to maybe we'll start a text thread on this. Who can we keep bringing on to actually get to the solving part? Who are the other thinkers who are doers who can be part of this conversation of how do we solve? I would love to do that. So maybe the next time you come back, we bring a couple of other people and let's just have an actual conversation. In this country, what kind of immigration system do you want? We have a merit system and a family-based system, right? Do we want to be like Canada or Australia and make it all about merit? And if you want to make it all about merit, all those Ellis Island immigrants who came from Italy and Germany and Ireland before they got just to be this thing called white, what was their merit?
Well, the thing I love about immigrant populations, and this is true of every educational level, is just the level of entrepreneurship and business formation and everything else. And
hustle.
That's not advanced degree type stuff. That's you go to any immigrant community and you see small businesses, restaurants, shops, on and on and on. And that's the future in my mind. I mean, that's the dynamism and lifeblood.
And I would argue that was also our past, right? That's what the Germans and the Swedish and the Norwegians. And that's why whenever we talk about what's happening with Indians and Filipinos and Koreans, what I find just so dehumanizing is when we think of them as these others, when in reality, the Germans and the Italians and the Irish and the Swedish, that's what they were doing too. And if we can't bridge that divide, then that in itself is the failure of the American experiment. Thank you, by the way, for our audience who tweeted or DM'd these questions to us. Okay, question 1. What do you think about billionaires becoming part of our government? And how will their profits first focus influence policies like immigration?
It makes me super disheartened that we've kind of merged into this quasi plutocracy. I know some billionaires. Some of them are fine people. Some of them are the opposite of fine. But in my mind, the role of government is to be like a balancer and line drawer, and having someone in position to draw a line and then have their commercial interest benefit from that line drawing it's crony capitalism, and it's what you're trying to avoid. But at this point, the institutional safeguards have broken down to a point where we're entering a realm where billionaires have like extraordinary influence, and I wish it were different. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but then I hope that we end up coming out the other side at some point.
One last question. What are your hopes? Do you have any hopes for this new administration?
For this new administration, I mean, wow. Wow. I mean,
any at all?
I'm sure that there'll be something I like out of like the 100 or 1,000 things that go down. One of the things I will say, and I don't know how this is going to come across, I'm someone who thinks that we have the resources to alleviate poverty at scale, but one of the things that is holding us back is that we do have resources that are getting spent in really bizarre, unfortunate, inefficient ways. I'm going to throw military spending in like a category. It's like that there's a lot of money being spent. I had a friend in the Air Force tell me that his least favorite time of the year was right before budget. Like budgets are meant to be reported, and then he flies over the ocean and dumps fuel into the ocean in his plane. And then I was like, why do you do that? And he's like, well, we have to say we used a certain amount of fuel so we can get the same budget the next year. So if we have any fuel left over, then I go dump it in the ocean.
Our $1 billion military industrial complex.
It's like closer to $1 trillion at this point.
Oh, $1 trillion.
So one of the things I do think might come out of this administration is a questioning of and a diminution of some of the resources we're spending on certain things, because I'd like those resources to go to people.
Yeah.
And right now sometimes they're going to bureaucracies and costs. And certainly, my friend's story of dumping fuel in the ocean, like, is an example.
One follow-up with the universal basic income with Humanity Forward. Is that something that you'd want to go to President Trump and talk about?
Hey, and one thing actually I should say that I think is likely to come out of this administration is a revival of the enhanced child tax credit, which is anti-poverty. It's good for poor kids, and I don't care who passes it. And I think that this crew may pass it because I heard that a number of them are on board with it.
So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated this conversation.
Real pleasure, man. And thank you for bringing humanity to so many people.
Well, that means a lot coming from you. Thank you.